friend Thomas the Tank Engine. He wanted to come out of his station yard and see the world. These stories tell you how he did it.
Hello everybody. This is Elsbridge Studios, and welcome to The History of the Skarloey Railway. Sort of. Like last time, I intend to look at the history of the Skarloey Railway as outlined by the Awdrys, and fill in some of the gaps they've left. And as before, the edges have been color-coded, to distinguish between different types of information. Of course, if you are only interested in established railway series lore, then watch this video by the Unlucky Tug. One thing I should point out is the Skarloey Railway is based off of the Cros-ny-Cuirn Railway, near Tywyn in Wales. Wilbert Awdry, known by the fandom as the Thin Clergyman, volunteered on the Cros-ny-Cuirn Railway as a guard as well as some other jobs too. His model railways, a map of Sodor, and many of his other railway series possessions are displayed in the Railways Museum at Tywyn Station. And with that out of the way, let's begin. Like last time, we will start with the Skarloey Railway's predecessor. The Skarloey Railway dates back to 1865. However, its origins technically go back to 1806. In 1806, the Crovan's Gate Mining Company found copper in the lower slopes of Wardfell. A light railway was built from Cros-ny-Cuirn down to a small port at Balladwale. Pack horses brought the copper to Cros-ny-Cuirn. It was then loaded into wagons, which were rolled down to Balladwale, then more horses would bring the empty wagons back up. The line, known simply as the railroad, ran until 1863. In 1820, the track was relaid. It was around this time a chain of 5 inclines were built from Cros-ny-Cuirn up the slopes of Wardfell. During the early 1850s, the Sodor and Mainland Railway built a line from Ballyhoo to Crickronan, via Crovan's Gate and Kildane. Not long after, the Crovan's Gate Mining Company closed the line from Crovan's Gate down to Balladwale, and would transport their minerals to Kirkronan using the Mid-Sodor Railway. Over the years the Festiniog Railway in Wales grew, and eventually switched out horses and inclines for steam engines. Following their footsteps, in the early 1860s the Crovan's Gate Mining Company planned to replace their horses with steam engines too. During the early 1860s, James Swinton Spooner was tasked with the construction of the Cros-ny-Cuirn Railway, as well as providing assistance on the Festiniog Railway. But in 1863, he came to Sodor to survey a suitable route for the new railway. During this time, Mr. Spooner accidentally rediscovered Skarloey, a lake hidden in the woods. Up until this point, the plan had been to build a mineral railway. But following this discovery the decision was made to make the railway for passengers too. The idea being that the lake could be a popular place for tourists. In preparation for this, the principal landowner at Skarloey, Shamus Tebrock, built a hotel and several villas. However, between the planned site for the station and the hotel there was a steep slope, so a self-operated rope incline to get supplies from the railway to the hotel was built. When the hotel was finished the incline was left intact for guests to use for their luggage. The mining company cancelled their order for some old second-hand coaches, then made a new order for 5 brand new coaches from Brown Marshalls and Company. Agnes was first class, and rather stuck up. Ruth, Lucy and Jemima were third class. And Beatrice was the guard's van. The railway also placed an order with Fletcher Jennings and Company, locomotive builders in Whitehaven, to build 2 engines. In May of 1865, the first engine, a Fletcher and Jennings C-Class 040 saddle tank engine, arrived on Sodor. Unfortunately, when he arrived the port at Kirkronan wasn't finished, so there weren't any cranes to lift him off of the ship. Instead, workers used the ship's derrick, and nearly turned the little engine upside down. He was eventually loaded onto a truck and taken along the Sodor and Mainland Railway to Crovan's Gate. Number 1 was very stubborn as he didn't want to pull trucks. Since his driver fireman and Mr. Mack, the manager, didn't understand engines, they couldn't get number 1 in steam. Mr. Mack sent an angry letter to Fletcher Jennings and K.O. They in turn sent Mr. Bobby, one of the engineers that had built number 1, to Crovan's Gate. For the next 2 years he visited Sodor regularly to ensure both engine crews and fixers knew how to look after engines. While on Sodor, Mr. Bobby would drive number 1, as at first, this was the only way to get him to work. In October of 1865, the railway's number 2 arrived, a Fletcher and Jennings BB040 well tank engine. He and number 1 didn't get on at first, but they both worked hard regardless. It was around this time that the line was completed, and the inclines were closed. The line started at Crovan's Gate, where it met the Sodor and Mainland Railway. This was where the sheds and workshops were built. The line ran up to Cros-ny-Cuirn where the inclines used to start. Although heavily overgrown, they can still be seen from the level crossing to this day. After 5.5 miles, or 9 kilometers, the line reaches the halfway point at Glennock. Beyond this the railway passes several cottages and farms, as well as the local school. The line next went to Cros-ny-Cuirn, named after a pair of nearby waterfalls. The line eventually came to Skarloey. Beyond the station there was a short line to the quarry at Wardfell. Shortly after the line was finished, the 2 engines were given names. Number 1 was named Skarloey, after the lake in the woods. And number 2 was named Cros-ny-Cuirn, after the twin waterfalls near Cros-ny-Cuirn station. Skarloey was chosen to pull a special train, so the board of directors could give the line one last check before an inspector from the Board of Trade came to make sure the line was safe for passengers. Skarloey was steady on the journey up, but the journey down was different. On the journey down, Mr. Mack rode on the footplate. He was even allowed to drive for a short distance. Unfortunately, Skarloey began to bounce, so Mr. Mack tried to slow down, but he moved the regulator too fast and too much, causing Skarloey to bump the coaches. Even though it was an accident, the coaches decided to bump into Skarloey hard enough to knock Mr. Mack off the footplate and into a bush. The directors then complained that they had been bumped about too, so Skarloey was shut in the shed when the inspector came the following day. However, the inspector came to see Skarloey and he explained that the engine just needed an extra pair of wheels. Regardless, they passed the inspection and the Skarloey Railway was officially opened for business. When the Skarloey Railway opened in late 1865, both Skarloey and Cros-ny-Cuirn were hard at work. They would take tourists up to the waterfalls and the lake, bring the locals down to the markets, and collected minerals from the quarry. However, Skarloey's bouncing was causing trouble. At first the directors ignored it, but by 1867 they had had enough. So following the inspector's advice, in 1867 Skarloey was sent back to Whitehaven so Fletcher Jennings and K.O. could fit the extra wheels the inspector had suggested. Whilst he was away, Skarloey also had a cab built. At first, Skarloey liked his new cab, and the coaches commented on how handsome he looked. But Skarloey soon got sick of it. This was because the driver would always choose him to pull the train on rainy days. Skarloey also had a big falling out with Cros-ny-Cuirn over his new cab. Then on one rainy day, a landslide blocked the line up to the quarry. Skarloey was unable to stop in time and derailed. The quarry workers tried to put Skarloey back on the rails, only to find he was stuck in the mud. At first Cros-ny-Cuirn refused to help Skarloey. but when his driver pointed out that Mr. Bobby and the quarry workers were there too, he gave in. When they returned to Crovan's Gate, both engines had a good laugh at how silly Skarloey looked, and they have been best friends ever since. For years both engines worked hard, but because of his cab, and because he was easier to repair, Skarloey was used more often. Because of this, in 1897 Skarloey was sent back to Whitehaven again for heavy repairs. It is unknown when exactly, but by this point the Skarloey Railway built a cab for Cros-ny-Cuirn out of spare metal from the workshop. The railway had set up a big publicity campaign for the railway which saw huge numbers of visitors. But after a few years, there were only small number of summer tourists and local anglers that went up to Skarloey. Then, in 1900 the copper began to run out. But a worker found good slate at the quarry to use as secondary freight. In 1901, the Sodor Mainland Railway was short on funds. So, they sold their number 2, Neil, a Nielsen and 040 box tank, to the Skarloey Railway to deliver their goods down to port at Kirk Ronan. However, this wasn't enough and the Sodor Mainland closed in 1904. The railway had to keep delivering copper to Kirk Ronan, even when Neil was in need of repairs. So the railway built a haulage wagon. The idea was that Skarloey was loaded onto it, and then he could use it to run on the standard gauge track of the old Sodor Mainland Railway to Kirk Ronan, whilst Cros-ny-Cuirn ran the Skarloey Railway. Also in 1901, Agnes was cross that third-class passengers were allowed to ride in her on busy market days when the other coaches were full. One day she lost her patience, so she purposely broke her coupling, and then derailed. She was recovered, but was shunted to the back of the workshop, and left there until she could be trusted to behave. In 1902, Cros-ny-Cuirn was pushed off the rails by his trucks and he rolled down an embankment. He was recovered and repaired, but he refused to take trucks again. However, when Skarloey was ill, Cros-ny-Cuirn confronted the trucks. And after a long day stopping all of the trouble the trucks caused, they decided to never play tricks on Cros-ny-Cuirn again. In 1903, some calves escaped from a field and strayed onto the line. Skarloey had to drive them down the line to where a farmer was waiting to take them away. Then in 1908, the copper completely ran out, and so the mining company lost interest in the railway. In 1909, they sold the railway to Handel Brown, principal landowner of most of the land near the railway, and the MP for East Sodor. Over the course of World War I there was a boom in demand for slate. However, this demand plummeted when the war was over. Despite this, Mr. Brown kept the quarry open for the few clients he still had. During the war, the North Western Railway was built on Sodor and met the Skarloey Railway at Crovan's Gate to collect their passengers and slate, and bring them more tourists throughout the 1920s. In 1936, the previous general manager retired, so Mr. Brown promoted his most faithful employee, Robert Sam, to become the new general manager. Throughout the 1930s many countries such as the UK, USA, and most of Europe, were hit by the Great Depression. This had a huge effect on the North Western Railway. Whilst not as large, it also had a significant effect on the Skarloey Railway. But despite soaring costs and dwindling profits, Mr. Brown kept the line open. His efforts were recognized, and in 1937 he was created a baronet, becoming Sir-Handel Brown. Also in 1937, Cros-ny-Cuirn had major repairs carried out at Crovan's Gate. World War II started in 1939. The following year in 1940, there was another boom in the demand for slate, due to the Blitz. It was around this time that the mine was taken over by the Ministry of Defense to be used as an ammo dump. Because of this massive increase in work, engines, rolling stock, and staff were brought on loan, but left when the war ended in 1945. As Skarloey was preferred by the driver and fireman, he was used more often. This meant that by 1945 his parts were worn out. As the railway couldn't afford to repair Skarloey, an open shed was built at Crovan's Gate so he could see and talk to everyone while he waited. Renius, meanwhile, had to run the line by himself. Not long after, Skarloey discovered that the engines on the North Western Railway called their controller, Sir Topham Hatt, the Fat Controller. Since he was rather slim, Skarloey decided to give the general manager of the Skarloey Railway, Robert Sam, the nickname, the Thin Controller. Renius and various staff members started using this nickname too, but Mr. Sam didn't find out until long after he retired. In 1947, the Mid-Sodor Railway from Augsburg to Peel Godred closed. This led to rumors spreading about the future of the Skarloey Railway, but the line stayed open. In 1950, Sir-Handel Brown passed away in his sleep. His title, his estate, and the railway were inherited by his son, Sir-Handel Lloyd Brown II. Like his father before him, Sir-Handel II had a strong admiration for the railway. However, he also knew that his father's ways were too expensive, and that if the railway was to survive, things would need to change. This included delaying Skarloey's overhaul, increasing ticket prices, and many other things. But this was not enough. In 1951, Robert Sam retired as the general manager, and his son, Peter Robert Sam, became the next Thin Controller. At the same time, the railway's chief mechanical engineer, David Hugh, stepped down in favor of his son and Peter Sam's close friend, Ivo-Hugh. In 1951, Sir-Handel made plans to close the railway. Ivo-Hugh rallied the few remaining staff members, and with their backing Peter Sam was able to convince Sir-Handel to keep the line open for at least one more year, so that they had a chance to prove its worth. During this time a new quarry opened near Renius station, as a new source of slate had been found. This new slate had no impurities, which made it far more valuable. Later that year, Peter Sam made plans to have Skarloey overhauled, but since Renius was also on his last legs, he instead looked for a new engine. Meanwhile, in Peel Godred, Sodor's aluminium works had bought two engines from the recently closed Mid-Sodor Railway, Falcon, a Hughes Falcon 042 saddle tank engine built in Loughborough, and Stuart, a Kerr Stuart Tattoo class built in Stoke-on-Trent. The engines were used to help with the aluminium works expansion project. Peter Sam reached out to the aluminium works hoping to buy the engines. The aluminium works agreed to sell the engines to the Skarloey Railway when the expansion project was completed in 1952. During that time, Renius's valve gear jammed. Ivo-Hugh couldn't fix it properly, so he came up with a temporary solution and carefully nursed Renius along for another year. In 1952, Renius was sent away for his overhaul as soon as Stuart and Falcon arrived on the Skarloey Railway, having been bought for £25 each. £50 or $185 in total. This is about £1,700 or $2,000 in today's money. A real bargain, considering that a locomotive these days usually costs at least 1,000 times more than this, usually more. The two engines were painted in the Skarloey Railway's red livery, and the owner gave them new names. Falcon was renamed Sir-Handel, after the owner's father. And Stuart was renamed Peter Sam, to honor the Thin Controller's many years of dedicated service to the railway. Sir-Handel was first to run on their new railway, and caused a lot of trouble. He insulted everything, saying he was used to much better. he also insulted the coaches, so they caused trouble whenever Sir-Handel took them out. Then Sir-Handel had to collect some trucks from the quarry, so to prevent this, he pushed the rails apart and sank between them. When he was recovered, Sir-Handel was confined to the shed until he could be trusted. Peter Sam had a much better start. The coaches grew fond of him almost instantly. The trucks never played tricks. And all the trains ran on time. However, one morning Peter Sam was late, and Henry said if he was late that afternoon that he would leave Peter Sam's passengers behind. Peter Sam was so worried he accidentally set off early, and left the refreshment lady behind, so he had to stop and wait for her. When Peter Sam reached Crovan's gate, the refreshment lady told Peter Sam that Henry couldn't leave without them because he was a guaranteed connection. Then, one market day, Peter Sam needed repairs, so Sir-Handel was let out of the shed. He tried to behave, but when he performed an emergency stop to avoid running over a sheep, the coaches thought he had bumped them on purpose. They decided to bump Sir-Handel at the points just outside Crovan's gate, causing him to derail and suffer minor damage. That meant he couldn't work for the rest of the day. And since Peter Sam wasn't repaired either, Skarloey volunteered to take the last train of the day. The thin controller was hesitant as Skarloey was in terrible condition, but eventually he gave in. Skarloey gave it his all to pull the train and complete the return journey, but he paid the price. One of his springs had broken, some of his boiler tubes collapsed, and by the time he reached Crovan's gate he was leaking steam from all directions. The owner heard about Skarloey's great effort and decided it was finally time he had his overhaul. So Skarloey was sent to Gibbons Brothers Limited in Whitby. In 1953, up at Ulfstead Castle, the Earl of Sodor, Sir Richard Noramby, was going through the castle's records when he discovered a tattered document written in Sudrian. Since he was only 13 years old at the time, his Sudrian was quite poor, so he asked a member of Sodor's Archaeological Society to help him translate it. It turns out this was a poem from a copy of the Book of Sir Harold, a book about the life of Sir Harold Marone, Sodor's regent from 1263 to 1275. According to the text, Skarloey was used by Sir Harold as his secret sanctuary, and where he would rest between battles. Sodor's Archaeological Society went up to Skarloey and arranged several digs, during which they found enough evidence to support the text's claims. As a result, Skarloey quickly became a place of historical importance. This also led to an increase in tourists, as well as more visits from historians and archaeologists, greatly adding to the railway's revenue. Also in 1953, Ivo-Hugh built a petrol-powered inspection trolley called Ivo's Flying Bedstead, but engines and staff knew him simply as Mark I. Over the years Mr. Hugh gave Mark I several partial rebuilds, finally satisfied in 1987 when he completed the last rebuild to what is now known as Mark V. He lives on a siding at Cros-ny-Cuirn station as it is right next to Mr. Hugh's cottage. From 1945 to 1954, Wilbert Awdry, known amongst the fandom as the Thin Clergyman, had written 9 books about the Northwestern Railway. In 1954, Awdry heard about Skarloey and Renius, and their little train that ran up into the hills. So Awdry went to the Skarloey Railway to see them, only to find they had both been sent away for overhauls. He did however hear a bit about the railway's history, Sir-Handel getting into trouble when he first arrived, Peter Sam accidentally leaving the refreshment lady behind, and Skarloey pulling a train despite being in a dire state. These stories appeared in Awdry's next book, 4 Little Engines. First published on the 22nd of November, 1955. The Skarloey Railway proved popular with readers, So over the years the railway and its engines appeared in at least 6 more books in the railway series. With an increase in revenue, the owner decided to have the track inspected and repaired. This task was given to Ivo-Hugh. At first, he and the workmen managed, but their workload soon grew. In 1957, Mr. Hugh asked the thin controller if he could have a diesel engine to help with the extra work. With permission from the owner, the thin controller bought a diesel from Ruston and Hornsby Limited in Lincoln. Mr. Hugh gave the engine the nickname Rusty. He liked it, so the name stuck. In 1958, Sir-Handel was sick of taking trucks. So, following Gordon's advice, Sir-Handel pretended to be ill so he wouldn't have to pull trucks. Peter Sam had to do his work for him, which he didn't mind. However, the trucks at the quarry mistook him for Sir-Handel, so they broke the coupling whilst on the incline and crashed into Peter Sam, damaging him. Sir-Handel had to do all the work until the railway bought a spare engine. Specifically Duncan, an Andrew Barclay E-Class 040, built in Kilmarnock in Scotland. Duncan was built for 2-foot gauge, about 610 mm. He had to be re-gauged to run on the Skarloey Railway, which was 2-foot 3-inch gauge, about 686 mm. However, the re-gauge wasn't done properly, so Duncan rode roughly, and on top of that, his roof kept scraping on the roof of the tunnels. Duncan was also blunt, grumpy, and very rude. Later in 1958, Skarloey returned from his overhaul, and Peter Sam told him that while he was away the railway had acquired some new rolling stock. Ada, Jane and Mabel are a trio of open coaches. Gertrude and Millicent, bogie coaches that were built using the frames from 2 old Mid-Sodor Railway coaches. And finally Cora, who was Peter Sam's brake van back when he worked on the Mid-Sodor Railway. As soon as Skarloey was in steam, Duncan got stuck in a tunnel, so Skarloey had to bring some workmen to free him. And since Duncan refused to move, Skarloey had to take the train to the end of the line and back. Duncan just sulked the whole time. A few days later, Duncan insulted Rusty when the diesel warned him to take care just before Cros-ny-Cuirn station. Duncan ignored him and derailed. At first Rusty refused to help, until Skarloey pointed out that the passengers needed help too. In 1959, Skarloey celebrated his 95th birthday. As part of the celebrations, the owner invited the BBC to film a documentary about the Skarloey Railway. During the documentary, Skarloey pulled a passenger train, Duncan pulled a goods train, Rusty and Mr. Hugh did some maintenance work, and Peter Sam pulled the TV train. Sir-Handel didn't want to be involved, so he pretended to be ill. The thin controller wanted all the engines involved though. So he decided that Sir-Handel's driver and fireman should take him to pieces for a segment on engine maintenance, much to Sir-Handel's annoyance. Towards the end of the program, Skarloey was asked to make a speech, when he revealed that whilst he was away, Skarloey was reunited with his twin, Talyllyn, the #1 engine on the Talyllyn Railway in Tywyn in Wales. The 2 engines had been built side by side back in 1864 and are still working to this day. Also in 1959, the thin controller found an old saloon coach from the Mid-Sodor Railway in a garden in Harwich. He bought the coach and had it restored. At least 8 more coaches from the Mid-Sodor Railway have been bought and restored since then. By 1960 the old slate quarry at Wardfell had been exhausted, so the railway sold it to the Ministry of Defence, who used it as an ammo dump, as well as storage for uranium collected from the recently reopened mine at Toryrek. They also brought their own engine to shunt their trucks. A little battery-powered engine. The engines rarely saw him and knew very little about him, but they later discovered his name was Corporal Harris, or Harris for short. He was friendly with the engines on rare occasion he saw them, but due to the nature of his work he remained very secretive. In 1961, Peter Sam's funnel was knocked off by a huge icicle, so his crew used an old drain pipe as a temporary replacement. The other engines found it very funny, and Sir-Handel made up a song.
Peter Sam said again and again, his new funnel will put us to shame. Went into the tunnel, lost his old funnel, now his famous new funnel's a drain.
However, Peter Sam got the last laugh. His new funnel had a diesel injector which made puffing easier, and as a result, his work became easier too. Because of Skarloey's long wheelbase, he had trouble going round tight bends, so the railway was laid half an inch wider than it should have been. Unfortunately, this meant Sir-Handel kept sinking between the rails, so in 1961, Sir-Handel was given new wheels with wider tyres to prevent this. The other engines teased him about his new wheels. That was until Sir-Handel, who was usually late, was all of a sudden arriving early instead. So he began boasting that his new wheels made him faster. Then one day, Skarloey suggested that Sir-Handel should deal with George, the local council steamroller, who was always rude to the engines. At first Sir-Handel thought that that would be easy, but it wasn't. Then one day George crashed into Sir-Handel's train and their drivers argued about whose fault it was. Had a policeman not shown up a couple of minutes later, this could have been a lot worse. The next day the workers finished their work on the road and went away, taking George with them. Sir-Handel thought he had made George go away, so he boasted about it, until some boys came to see the engines, and one joked that Sir-Handel was nearly beaten in a race by a steamroller. He has never mentioned steamrollers since. Then the council tried to sue the Skarloey Railway over the incident with George, and claimed not having a proper crossing being the main cause. However, the owner had seen the whole incident from his study, and he knew that the railway wasn't at fault, and that the incident happened long before Sir-Handel reached the crossing. So he decided to make a counterclaim against the council. After the photographer of a local newspaper stepped forward with pictures confirming the owner's version of events, the council lost the case and had to pay a large sum to the railway. However, the owner agreed to build a light and bell warning system in 1966, providing the council covered half of the costs. They reluctantly agreed. Later in 1961, preparations were being made for Renius's return after his overhaul. Duncan meanwhile was grumpier than ever. Eventually he got so fed up he stopped on the viaduct and refused to move. Skarloey had to recover Duncan and his train, and then take them back home. That evening, Skarloey told the other engines about the time Renius pulled his train home despite one of his valve gears being jammed. After hearing that story, Duncan tried to be a better engine, though not always successfully. Renius came home the following day, and a huge celebration was held. In 1963, Culdee, an 060 rack rail steam engine, returned to Sodor after being in Switzerland for an overhaul. His truck was shunted into a siding near the Skarloey Railway, just as Sir-Handel and Duncan were complaining about the coaches, but they stopped when they saw Culdee. Culdee told them about the coaches on his railway, as well as what happened to Godred, an engine from Culdee's railway, when he thought he knew better, and as a result he derailed and tumbled down the mountain. After hearing that Sir-Handel and Duncan were much better behaved. In 1963 the railway used the money from the sale of the Wardfell quarry to build an extension that looped around the lake at Skarloey, and the new lakeside station on the far side of the lake. From April to September most passenger trains go to Skarloey via the lakeside loop. The rest of the year the trains bypass the loop and go straight to Skarloey. The loop line was completed in 1965, just in time for the railway's centenary. The plan was to make a documentary about how the Skarloey Railway had changed over the last 100 years. And to then have the Duke of Sodor open the extension. All went well, until Duck told Peter Sam that all Duke engines had been scrapped. Peter Sam thought that the centenary would be ruined. And he couldn't believe it when the Duke that came to open the extension was actually a man, not an engine. Later in 1965, the Skarloey Railway acquired an oil-fire steam engine called Adeline. She was given low-level military clearance, and pulled most of the trains into and out of the Ministry of Defence's ammo dump. This was because as her fire burnt oil instead of coal, Adeline didn't release any sparks from her funnel, which would have been very dangerous in an area filled with explosives. Following a share issue in 1966, the owner decided to no longer keep the railway private, and it becomes a public company. However, the owner kept the majority of the shares. The rest of the shares being bought by staff members, including the Thin Controller and Mr. Hugh. Over the course of 1968, there were several mysterious mishaps at the quarry, and with the MOD trains. It was later discovered to be sabotage. One day the saboteur fitted a bomb to a train filled with enough explosives to set off the uranium store. Adeline took the train away as fast as she could. On her instructions, her driver jumped clear as there wouldn't have been enough time to uncouple Adeline before the bomb exploded. It is believed that Adeline was destroyed in the explosion, risking herself to save Sodor from nuclear fallout. An extensive search was carried out, but Adeline was never found. Since the Duke of Sodor's visit in 1965, Sir-Handel and Peter Sam thought about when they used to work on the old Mid-Sodor Railway, and about their number 1, Duke, a George England engine that had been named after the Duke of Sodor. The two engines told the other stories about Duke and his adventures. These stories soon spread like bees. Mr. Hugh heard the engines talking about Duke. He then told the Thin Controller. The Thin Controller told the owner. The owner told the Duke. The Duke told Fergus Duncan, the controller of the Arlesdale Railway. Mr. Duncan told the thin clergyman, Wilbert Awdry. And Awdry told his close friend Teddy Boston, known amongst the fandom as the Fat Clergyman. In 1969, the two clergymen came to Sodor to meet with Mr. Duncan, and the three discussed the possibility that Duke could still be around. Awdry and Boston walked along the route of the old Mid-Sodor Railway, hoping to find Duke. They believed that he would be in the shed, but when they arrived they couldn't find the shed. What they didn't know was that the shed had been buried under 22 years of mudslides and vegetation. The fat clergyman climbed a small hill to get a better look, accidentally stood on the fragile roof of the old shed, fell through it, and landed on top of Duke's saddle tank. After this, Fergus Duncan sent some workmen to lift Duke out of the shed and onto a lorry, where the Duke of Sodor was waiting. Duke was sent to Crovan's Gate, where the Duke of Sodor paid to have him restored, then permanently loaned him to the Skarloey Railway. In 1980, Peter Robert Sam retired as general manager and was replaced by his son Roger Peter Sam Sr. In 1982, the Talclin Railway's number 3, Sir-Haydn, needed repairs. With the owner's permission, the Thin Controller offered to let the Talclin Railway borrow Sir-Handel, as soon as Duke returned from his repairs at the works. Sir-Handel got quite impatient waiting for Duke to come back. In fact, he was so impatient he accidentally left the guard behind. Duke was soon repaired, and Sir-Handel went to the Talclin Railway. Whilst Sir-Handel was away, the Skarloey Railway had trouble with brambles. One day, Peter Sam was late, so instead of waiting for the line to be cleared, he tried to push some brambles out of the way, and got stuck. So his driver and guard had to cut him out. In 1983, Rusty and Mr. Hugh were cutting back trees that were too close to the line. Peter Sam was tasked with taking the logs and branches away. One day, neither Peter Sam or his crew checked that their trucks were coupled up properly, so the trucks broke free and fell off the old iron bridge. Peter Sam was confined to the yard and Duncan took over his work. Duncan teased Peter Sam until Rusty told him a ghost story about an engine that fell off the old iron bridge. Duncan's crew decided to take him down a peg or two by playing a trick on him, and make him think that there really was a ghost. Duncan was cross with his crew, but from then on he was better behaved. Later that year, the leader of the local Boy Scouts decided that they should do their volunteering project on the Skarloey Railway. One day it was very hot and the Scouts had nothing to drink. Their leader stopped Duncan and asked if he and his crew could find some drinks for the Scouts and drop them off on the way back. The refreshment lady at Skarloey had run out of drinks, but luckily Duncan was able to get some from Lakeside instead. Duncan has since grown quite fond of the Scouts. In 1984, Sir-Handel came home from the Skarloey Railway. He told the other engines that while he was there he met a prince, and he pulled a wedding train. Then one day, he was hit by a branch. He wasn't hurt, but his crew made a big fuss and made him wear an eye patch. People joked that he looked like a pirate. During the 1980s, Mr. Hugh acquired the leftover parts of 2 old diesels. By 1989, he had used these parts to build one engine, Fred. Fred proved to be unreliable and was regularly ill, so Mr. Hugh spent a lot of time trying to mend him. In 1991, Ivo-Hugh retired as the railway's chief mechanical engineer, and was replaced by his son, David Ivo-Hugh. Peter Sam made several visits to the Skarloey Railway during the 1990s. He came back to the Skarloey Railway for a brief period in 1996. While he was home he talked about his experiences on the Skarloey Railway. On the Skarloey Railway, a special powder is added to the water to make it taste better. Unfortunately, one day someone put too much powder into the water just before Peter Sam had a drink. As a result, he ended up covered in sludge. Peter Sam wanted to go to the shed and be cleaned up, but since some visitors were coming to see him, he was put in a siding by the station so he could be seen, much to his embarrassment. Also in 1996, Fred was ill again, so Rusty had to pull the weed killer train. Then Renier slipped on the rails because they were covered in too much weed killer. Then Sir-Handel got cross, so he broke his fire bars. He was confined to the sheds until some new fire bars could be found, but Sir-Handel thought he was left in the shed for causing trouble. Over the course of 1996, the Skarloey Railway built a new engine. On the day of the naming ceremony, Skarloey was sent up the line to collect some important people, but was delayed when a sow and her piglets strayed onto the line. Luckily, the pigs were rounded up and Skarloey was able to get to the ceremony on time. The old chief mechanical engineer, Ivo-Hugh, who had retired 5 years earlier, was asked to present the engine's name at the ceremony. To his surprise, the new number 7 was named Ivo-Hugh in honor of his years of service to the railway. In 1998, Skarloey was buried by an avalanche following a snowstorm and had to be dug out. In 2009, a stone got stuck in Ivo-Hugh's funnel. He was going to blast it out, but Jim, Ivo-Hugh's fireman, convinced him not to. Ivo-Hugh later found out that if he had tried to blast the stone out he would have damaged his pipes. Later that year Jim had an ear infection and fell out of Ivo-Hugh's cab. The engine eventually convinced his fireman to see a doctor. During the late 1990s, Duncan stumbled upon a routine preformed by American comedian George Carlin. Duncan was instantly hooked and kept watching his acts until later in 2009 when he passed away.
He didn't pass away, he died. That's what happened.
Shortly afterwards, his driver's granddaughter cheered him up by showing Duncan the American adaptation of the Thomas and Friends TV series. To Duncan's pleasant surprise, he found out that in the American dub, George Carlin narrated Series 3 and 4, as well as redubbing Series 1 and 2, and played Mr. Conductor in the human segments of Shining Time Station. Not long afterwards, Duncan was told his Taleclin counterpart, Douglas, had been painted to look like him for a couple of years. And the Thin controller asked if Duncan would like to be painted to look like Douglas for a couple of years. Duncan instead asked if he could be painted into the livery his model wore in the TV series, as an ode to George Carlin, and the Thin controller agreed. Duncan has since recited many of George Carlin's routines, and even come up with his own jokes in the same style as George Carlin. In 2011, Sodor was hit by a huge storm. All the railways on Sodor were affected. Next to Marthwaite Station on the Arlesdale Railway was an old mill, which had been turned into a museum. Its roof had been torn off by the storm and the museum couldn't afford to repair it. Blister One discovered that the mill was powered by Atlas, an engine from the old Mid-Sodor Railway. This information made its way to the Skarloey Railway. The railway bought Atlas and had him restored, and the money the museum made from the sale was used to repair the roof of the old mill. After Atlas was restored, he took over Fred's work so he could have an overhaul and have his unreliable engine replaced with a new one. In 2012, Adeline was found in the ravine below the old iron bridge. It turns out that she had fallen off of the bridge and had been at the bottom of the river for years, where she couldn't be seen or heard. But a dry spell had lowered the water level enough for her to get Duncan's attention. After she was found, Adeline was airlifted to Crovan's Gate, where Mr. Hugh rebuilt her as a coal-fire engine with a new shape. She was also given a pair of specially made glasses as 44 years at the bottom of a river had damaged her eyesight. Adeline suffered from PTSD and partial amnesia. This made working on the railway difficult for Adeline and the other engines, but with help from the other engines she recovered her memories and conquered her fears. At around the same time the Ministry of Defence were closing their ammo dump, seeing no further use for it. They were planning to take Harris with them, but after a brief discussion with Adeline, Roger Sams Sr. bought Harris from the MOD. He is now the station pilot at Crovan's Gate. In 2015, Roger Peter Sams Sr. retired and was replaced by his son, Roger Peter Sam Jr. In 2017, the road from Crovan's Gate to Balladwale was in such a bad state that it was closed for repairs, cutting off the people who lived in Balladwale. After many discussions with landowners and the council, the Skarloey Railway was given permission to extend the line from Crovan's Gate to Balladwale, providing people in Balladwale access to the rest of the island whilst the road was closed. This extension remains open to this day and has proven quite popular. In 2022, Sir-Handel Lloyd Brown II died. His title and the railway were inherited by his son, Sir-Handel Qualtrough Brown III. And that brings us to the present day. If you enjoyed this video on my interpretation of Sodor's history, then please, like, subscribe and ring that notification bell. I'll see you again soon.